The tabletop takeaway.
Game mechanics on display.
3 designers share the stage.
Pick a genre and we'll play.
The tabletop takeaway.
Welcome back to the Tabletop Takeaway. I'm Ananda.
I'm Charlie McCarran.
And I'm Trevor Muller-Hagel.
And today, to finish up our series in asymmetric games, we're going to be talking about the Great Zimbabwe. So, the Great Zimbabwe is a game from Splatterspielen, which is famous for a particular style of games that they make. It's kind of hard to describe, but anyway, they're really good. In the Great Zimbabwe, we are different African tribes building monuments to honor our chosen gods. And so the game is all about building these monuments, which are worth points. You know, the more monuments you have and the taller the monuments are, the more points you get. And in order to build the monuments, you need to have craftsmen produce goods, which you can use at the monuments, and the craftsmen need access to resources, and you need to pay the craftsmen, which you do in cattle, which are the resource. And the game has a very, very interesting economy built in. Basically, players build craftsmen, and then whenever someone uses the craftsman, they pay cattle to the owner of the craftsman, who gets it the next round. So you have these cattle that are flowing in between different players. And at the same time, turn order is very important because there's a limited number of resources. And every round, players are bidding on turn order. But it's called the Generosity of Kings phase. And what's special about this bid is that the cattle you're paying are being distributed evenly among all the players. So if you bid a lot, everybody's going to get some of those cattle.
Meaning you are as well.
Right, you are as well.
Yeah.
And so the thing about the Great Zimbabwe, which makes it interesting, specifically when we're talking about asymmetry, is that there is asymmetry in the game, but it doesn't start out asymmetric. At the start of the game, everybody's in pretty much the same position. And then at some point in the game, you have the opportunity to choose a god, one of 8 gods, and each god has a very different power that is going to have a very different impact on how you approach the game. So, for example, in our game, my god was Anansi the Trickster, who has the ability that no matter how much a craftsman is charging for goods, you only pay 1 cattle to them.
Which is insane after you get going.
Right.
Yeah. Mine was that I could use... Normally you have to get a variety of resources to... but I could use any combination of resources, so I could just go for...
Same resource? Or?
Yeah. Yep. Which was pretty good and did change the game more than I was expecting.
Yeah.
But Trevor's was probably the most...
I got mine on
powerful.
the first turn of the game because I went first. And it allowed me to change a very core mechanic of the game, which is when you normally are trying to use a craftsman, that craftsman has to be within 3 spaces of your monument. I was able to go within 6 spaces of my monument. And then that craftsman has to have access to the resource within 3 spaces. That craftsman could do 6. So basically, I could put these craftsmen almost anywhere on the map, and they'd have access to all these resources. And they would be very far away from the other players. So I was kind of able to create my own little nodes of there's nothing actually nearby that they can use.
Yeah.
But because of my god's power, I could access everything on my turn.
Well, and not only that, but even if we did go near your craftsmen, they were still too far away from the resources.
Right.
Because, like, on your turn, you were able to access the resources from the craftsman, but on our turn we couldn't. So we couldn't even use your craftsman.
They were worthless
at all.
until you're able to create new resources at locations.
Right.
Yeah.
But the other interesting thing about the game is it is extremely interactive because when another person does something, other people are going to respond. For example, you did your thing,
Yeah.
where you set up your craftsmen so that we couldn't benefit from them. And so I, in response, took a specialist. Specialists are like, they're kind of like gods, but you can have multiple specialists.
Minor gods, almost.
Sort of, yeah. So you can have multiple specialists. So what I did was I took a specialist that let me place a resource, so then I started putting resources nearby your craftsmen so that I could use them.
Right. But
Yeah.
also meant that Charlie could use them.
Yeah. And yeah, when you first were explaining the game and I was looking at the god powers, I was sort of like, I don't think this is going to feel that asymmetric, but because the gameplay is pretty simple and you can only do a few things on your turn, the asymmetry feels like it's changes the gameplay a lot more than I was expecting.
I felt very powerful at first.
Yeah.
But then I didn't do the right order of operations, and so I fell behind because I wasn't actually keeping up with my monuments, and I was getting... Well, we should also explain how victory conditions work.
Yeah, so at the beginning of the game, when you start, the objective is get to 20 points first by building monuments. And the monuments points, the higher you build a monument, the more points you get for building it higher. It sort of accelerates.
Yep.
But the thing is, whenever you take a god or a specialist, or even when you build a craftsman, it increases your VR, your victory requirement, which has several implications. Yeah. The first one is that it is harder to win the game because you need more points. So like you take, you take Eshu, which was your god, Trevor. Your VR requirement went up by 4. So now you need 24 points instead of 20. And then you build a craftsman, which has a VR cost of 2, and now you need 26 instead of 20.
Yep.
But at the same time, your VR also influences where you are in bidding order, because whoever has the highest VR bids first, and that turns out to be extremely important because turn order is hugely important in this game.
You don't realize it until you're all trying to raise your monuments. And as soon as like those first couple resources are X'd out for that round, it's like, oh man, now I can't actually improve this from a 2 to a 3. And so you're actually vying for this power and for this expansion.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
And this is a common thing in Splotter games, which is that they make it so that, first of all, turn order is extremely important, and then they have mechanics that let people fight over turn order.
Yeah.
Which is something that I really like, because in a lot of games, there's something for deciding turn order, and it doesn't feel like it matters enough for the mechanic to be there.
Like you don't actually need to go first, but it's, I guess, fine if you do.
Yeah, it's like a minor benefit. But in Splotter games, it's like a huge thing. You really care about turn order.
Yeah, it's really interesting just kind of how it all unfolds. And obviously, like if I played again, I would play very differently. But that's also what's great, is that you have new gods that come out each time. And so you're able to approach the game completely neutral and equal. But then as soon as that first turn is done, it's likely that someone will have a god or will have already chosen a path that will completely make them different from how they operate from everyone else. So it's just a fun way to do asynchronous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my takeaway of this one sort of has to do with the rubber banding that happens in the game of building the monuments, where it's not like, it didn't feel like a regular kind of I guess building up progression.
Yeah.
You have to actually get a diversity of resources for other players. I didn't have to, but so I kind of knew that in order to get to the 5-level monument, you had to get 4 different types of resources, not just like any 4 resources. So Trevor couldn't even advance to level 5 because there wasn't a 4th type on the board.
The only 4th that was missing was really expensive and hard to get, which is diamonds.
Yeah.
So like to do that strategy, you really have to invest into it. And I didn't invest very much into the number of monuments I had, which actually I think is pretty great, that the only real cost of creating a monument from scratch is that you have to do it as your action.
Yeah.
and that's a huge cost when you have 6 or 7 actions in the game.
Yeah.
You know, like, wow, okay, so I have to make a new one, and then I was advancing my one monument a couple times all on its own, where Ananda had 2 or even 3 monuments that he'd advance all together. I was like, oh, that's actually a really good move. And I was focused, because as you grow your monument, as you raise the monument, you get a higher cattle income for your highest monument. So I'm like, okay, well, if I just focus on raising it higher, then that's a good enough benefit for me. But I actually got to the point where if I even got to that 5th level, I wouldn't have won. Mm-hmm. And so, like, realizing that my conditions had changed, and I didn't realize it in time, but like, oh, I should have hopped on that a lot sooner, and then you're able to kind of balance that a lot better. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really interesting game where, like, I normally don't like games that move the goalpost of what you're trying to accomplish, but this does it so kind of pervasively that, like, oh yeah, that's the expectation. Yeah. And obviously Cosmic Encounters, I moved the goalpost closer to myself, and that's a lot better. But every choice I made in this game, I moved it further away. Like, I had multiple craftsmen, and if I wanted to place craftsmen, I had to place them really far away so that other people couldn't access them. So I wasn't actually getting the cattle income from them as well. So it's an interesting push and pull of that game.
Yeah, and the moving goalposts, I really like that too. And it actually, I was thinking about it when we were talking about Root and the birds, with more power comes more responsibility. Mm-hmm. And that is the feeling of this game. Like, oh, you're worshiping a god that's stronger? Well, you're going to have to do a little better. You're going to
have to work harder.
Them.
Right.
Whereas there's the one god that has no special power, but it just
makes it easier.
Easier for
you
guys,
by 2
don't
worry about
points.
it. Live your lives, man. It's cool.
That's a good point. I hadn't made that connection to the birds, but yeah, it is a similar thing.
Yeah. I am wondering if Cole Worley and Patrick Leader played Great Zimbabwe as inspiration part. I don't know. Who knows? But yeah.
They may not even know.
Yeah. The reason I think that too is I just played Arcs recently, and another asymmetric game, but it starts out the first, unlike their other games.
Do you play the campaign or the
just basic? Game? And there's nothing asymmetric about that first game, essentially. Maybe your starting locations, but that game to me also felt like Great Zimbabwe in that every resource matters a ton. It's not like some games, which I don't love games when it's like collect a ton of cubes and then trade them into other types of cubes, and eventually you'll build up enough to like build an engine that gets just tons more cubes. It's kind of like every little resource point matters in this.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And granted, you get a lot of cattle. But...
You also don't accumulate resources, really, other than cattle. You have to trade cattle to have the resource the one time that you're using it.
Yeah.
And as long as you have access to the resource, you can use it and pay for it. It's really interesting.
Oh, there's one thing I'd like to highlight about the economy, which is so games where you have players selling things to other players, I think are pretty cool. Mm-hmm. Like the Otters and Root, for example, are a ton of fun. But one thing that the Great Zimbabwe does with its craftsmen that's really interesting is that so when you build a craftsman, you get to set the price for that good. You can set it at 1, 2, or 3 cattle, but the twist is, well, first of all, you can only set prices when you build a new craftsman. You can't just adjust it all the time. But the other sort of twist is that you cannot lower prices. You can only raise them. And the price actually matters a great deal because it's also the price you pay for using that craftsman. And if you don't have enough cattle, you can't use the craftsman, even though the cattle comes back to you.
Right.
And the cattle only comes back to you at the end of the round. It's not like immediate. So setting prices low, if you're the only one who can access that craftsman that you built, you want the price to be low so that you can use it a lot on your turn.
But if you're not going first, you may not get to use it.
Right.
Sorry, Charlie.
Yeah. I kind of shot myself in the foot by thinking like, oh, I'll raise the price so I get more cattle from you guys. But no.
Then Ananda also, his character didn't pay more when you raised the price
Well, yeah, that's why I picked Anansi.
because we kept upping
Yep.
the price of
Yeah.
everything.
But I think this is a really cool way to do things because it makes you think about the price a lot, right? You're not just like, oh, okay, I don't want anyone to buy anything, so I'll raise it to the max, or I don't care, so I'm going to lower it. Because first, I think the components that really matter are that you have to pay that price when you're using it, and it's not trivial for you because it's locking up your resources until next turn.
Right.
And that you cannot lower it, or like there are restrictions on when and how you can change the price, rather than the thing that the otters do, which is just, okay, at the end of your turn, decide what you want the price to be. It really makes you think about what prices you're setting while not asking you to do it all the time. Because you change the prices very few times during the game, so you can pay more thought to what you want them to be.
Yeah.
As opposed to asking players to change them every turn.
Yeah, and as soon as I saw that mechanic, I'm like, oh, this kind of reminds me of Lords of Waterdeep. Because when you create a building, if people use that building, then you get money for it. But that always felt pretty passive, and like you didn't really have a lot of control. But it's like, oh, I got a little benefit this time, cool. In this, you actually feel like you are in control of this craftsman and setting their prices. And it's like, well, if I also raise my prices too high, then I'm going to price out other people so they won't actually use it. Then that means because every single craftable item is equal to each other in terms of value, right? Mm-hmm. Unless you're starting to get to those higher tiers and you just need more variety, or if you have Charlie's ability, that where it doesn't matter what kind of item it is. Mm-hmm. And so it's just really interesting seeing that push and pull of real economic concepts happening in this game. That's actually pretty fast and resolves pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a really cool game economy.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, and I was also thinking, I love the yo-yo of the cattle, where like technically you are spending it, but half of the time you're getting them back.
Yeah.
And it's like, so I'm not actually spending something. I'm just using it for this turn, and then I'll get them back next turn, and then I'll also get my income next turn.
Right. There's two ways to use it. There's one way
Right.
that gets rid of it permanently, and one way that locks it up
Right.
for that turn.
Yeah, and I mean, even if you're bidding them, you can bid all of your cattle, and while it might get distributed to everyone else, if everyone else is bidding too, you may still end up with more cattle by the end of it, even though you bidded cattle at the first place. So, like, it's really just fascinating how that all plays out every turn.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you get takeaways?
Yeah.
What do you guys got? Yeah.
For me, my takeaway I think is going to be lying in the kind of simplicity of starting out in this symmetrical map, right? I started out even just a little bit more powerful by getting to place my monument first, and then I realized exactly how powerful that was after I got my god, because I chose the most beneficial spot, and that meant I could go anywhere on the map. And then I chose this god that synced with that perfectly, so I could literally go to the corners. It's like, oh wow, I can control this whole space. That's crazy. And so like having those moments of where you can really connect and have the players see those combos instantly is just great. Especially when you're going from, we're all equal at the very beginning, but I'm going to do this, and I'm going to try and do this in this path. And my success path completely went a different direction from Ananda's and Charlie's right from that first decision. And that's just really a really fascinating thing. So yeah, my takeaway is creating points of choice or opportunity for you to really change how the game is played is really just an interesting design space.
Mm-hmm. So I think my takeaway is that with asymmetric games, it's cool to have different abilities, and usually you start off with different abilities. Mm-hmm. And I think my takeaway from the Great Zimbabwe is that when you have abilities that players can choose part of the way through the game, it becomes extremely interactive when those abilities are unique. Like, if I take the ability, you can't take it.
Yeah.
Then players really have to react to each other in how they play. Because, you could just say, oh, well, I like this god and I like these specialists, so I'm always going to take them.
Right.
And if you do that, that may not work out that well, because if other players are paying attention, they can take a god that counters yours.
Right. or one of your, like, 'cause you can only take a god or a specialist.
Right.
If they take you the specialist you needed for that god,
Yes.
oh man, now what are you going to do?
Yeah, the Great Zimbabwe really encourages you to pay attention to what other players are choosing and react appropriately. And the special abilities that you take are often things that you only need for that one turn.
Right.
Like for example, I guess one of my specialists was the one that places a resource, and I did use that several times during the game. But another specialist that I took was the builder specialist, which refunds part of the cost of building a craftsman.
Yeah.
And the reason that I took that was because I needed a certain amount of cattle for the next turn, and that saved me those cattle.
Yeah.
And I only built one craftsman the whole game, but that was still worth it to me because of the way that my monuments mathed out. The amount of points that I was earning would still cover the extra VR cost, whether or not I took that specialist. And on the turn when I took the specialist, it really, really helped me.
Yeah.
And just that sort of things where, there are decisions that you can make in the short term that give you a unique benefit for the rest of the game. I think that's a really good way to do variable player powers, because then your unique identity is something that's tied to the way the game is crafted and not to like how that faction is set up, right?
Yeah.
I have these special powers that you don't have because the game went this way,
right?
And I needed them.
Yeah, and I think something that wanted to point out that makes that specialist system work well is when you take the specialist, you have to use that power,
right?
Which often involves spending cows.
Yeah.
So when you first were explaining the game, I'm like, why wouldn't you just take a specialist every turn?
Right.
But yeah, you really have to think hard. Is it worth doing that power right away?
Well, and it increases your VR.
Yeah.
And that was what kept stopping me. Like, you do have to activate the ability immediately, but like, I really wanted to get Herd. But Herd required, like, it gave you a plus 6 VR. I'm like, oh my God, that's so much. Like, right now I'm at a 28. That would put me at a 34. Mm-hmm. Oh, man. I don't know if that's worth it. And like, basically, you could invest cows to get more cows at the next turn.
Yeah.
Which is like, that's a great thing. But is it worth it? And I think maybe early game it might have been. But I never had the cow income to really make it worth it.
It's definitely worth it if you worship Obatala.
Okay.
I can.
There's a good synergy.
Say that.
Nice.
Awesome.
Well, yeah, cool game. Any last thoughts?
I did have one. I don't remember it though, unfortunately. I was going to try and summon it, and it's not there. But honestly, this was a great surprise of a game. I wasn't sure what to expect when Ananda was describing it, and it's a great little game. I really want to play Food Chain Magnet now. Like, that sounds, because I know that it's
another splatter game.
It's another splatter game, and it's it's been the talk of the town for a while now too. So, yeah,
cool. Well, tune in next time for our bonus wrap-up episode about asymmetric games.
Hey, thanks for listening to The Tabletop Takeaway. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. So please tell your friends and visit our website at thetabletoptakeaway.com, where you can suggest games and mechanics for us to cover next on the show.